And I'm reading some headlines from newspapers about Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg has most exclusive billionaire donors of any Democrat. That was from Forbes. The Hill. Pete Buttigieg tops billionaire donor list. Fortune. Pete Buttigieg takes lead as big business candidate in 2020 field. Washington Post. Pete Buttigieg lures even closer look from Wall Street donors following strong Iowa caucus performance. Forbes magazine. Here are the billionaires backing Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign.
So after his victory in the Iowa caucuses, Bernie Sanders has turned his attention to New Hampshire. And there's going to be a primary in New Hampshire early next week. But what the polling is showing right now is that while Bernie Sanders continues to lead in New Hampshire, either by a little bit or a lot, depending on the poll you look at, it's Pete Buttigieg and not Joe Biden that's emerging as his clear challenger at this stage. And that's likely due to the fact that Joe Biden had a very poor showing in Iowa, and also that the media narratives, false as they are around Pete Buttigieg winning Iowa, gave him a bump in the polls in New Hampshire specifically. But here's the deal. Pete Buttigieg's mythology, Pete Buttigieg's image, Pete Buttigieg's way of selling himself to the American people is not at all in accordance with who he actually is. And that's what Bernie Sanders is trying to show here. That Pete Buttigieg, maybe more than anybody else, is the choice candidate for the rich and wealthy and well-connected. Not just the millionaire class, but specifically the uber rich, the billionaire class, love Pete Buttigieg. And Bernie was reading off a series of reports from mainstream journalists which acknowledge that nobody more than Pete Buttigieg has captured the love and attention of America's richest and most powerful people. Even Joe Biden, who himself has a lot of support from those rich and wealthy and well-connected people, doesn't really have that same sort of intrigue that Pete Buttigieg does. And it's sort of interesting, right? Because Buttigieg likes to portray himself as outside of that politics as usual bubble. Pete Buttigieg likes to say that he's a small town mayor from the Midwest. He grew up in the Midwest, born and raised there. He understands the problem of that region more than anybody else. He's not a long-time politician. He didn't serve as a senator or as a vice president or both. He is sort of disconnected from the quote-unquote politics as usual. And that means he's in a sense untainted. He's the underdog. He's the pure candidate. He's the young guy coming from the outside to shake things up. And it's Bernie Sanders, even though he's a radical and even though Bernie Sanders has always challenged the status quo, who's the tired old dog because he's been a mayor and he's been a congressman and he's been a senator for generations now. And it's actually somebody like Pete Buttigieg that's the countercultural person coming in to wreak havoc on the status quo. And that's all BS. Pete Buttigieg is the premier status quo candidate. The person that's backed by the billionaires is almost always the status quo candidate. The person that's getting disproportionately positive coverage from the mainstream media, owned by billionaires or often supportive of billionaires, or the ads are funded by billionaires, and on and on and on. That's the status quo candidate. Pete Buttigieg has been raking in media accolades. He's been raking in billionaire dollars. He's been raking in media attempts to basically lie in his favor, as we've seen with the Iowa caucus results and how they've been reported by CNN. He is the key status quo candidate right now. And as Joe Biden continues to falter, if that indeed does continue on this trend, Pete Buttigieg will get even more establishment support as some of the Biden people move towards him. He is the candidate that's been designed almost as if in a lab to be the quote-unquote establishment antidote to Bernie Sanders and his progressive populism. That's the whole story here. Pete Buttigieg is not some regular midwestern small-town mayor who understands the struggle of working-class people. Pete Buttigieg did not have a working-class upbringing. Pete Buttigieg went to Ivy League schools. Pete Buttigieg worked for companies that helped other companies fix bread prices in Canada. Pete Buttigieg has done everything all the time, no matter what, not because he believes in anything, not because he has values, but because he was building a resume like a checklist so that he could one day run for president or governor or some other high office. That's why Pete Buttigieg has done everything he's done. When Bernie Sanders protested for civil rights 50 years ago, basically, he wasn't doing it to build a resume. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. Pete Buttigieg has never done anything just to do it, unless it's maybe to make a little bit of money and earn a little bit of influence. Wine Cave Pete is not the candidate for small town folks. Wine Cave Pete is not the candidate for young people trying to shake things up. Wine Cave Pete is not the candidate for the marginalized who have always felt like they've been left out of the political and social and economic processes dominated by the elites in coastal towns and in cities like Washington. And even if he tries to portray himself like that, there's no actual evidence that it's going to work. Pete Buttigieg did have a good result in Iowa. He basically had to lie about it to claim victory, but even if he does claim his second place finish, which is what he got, that's a good performance for him. And he's polling decently in New Hampshire, but it doesn't change the fact that he's got no real path to victory nationally, because at the end of the day, he struggles with core aspects of the Democratic Party base. Pete Buttigieg has basically no support among non-white people. Bernie Sanders does very well with Latino and Latina Americans, with Asian Americans. Joe Biden, whatever you think of him, does very well with African Americans and decent with other minority groups as well. Pete Buttigieg does not. That's the simple reality. When you look at people who are marginalized, people who have been left out of systems, people who have been left out of opportunities, it's people of color, disproportionately. And so you have to wonder, this supposed outside underdog small town mayor candidate isn't actually getting support from the people that feel left out of the process, because this Ivy League educated, bread price fixing company working guy isn't actually there for working class and marginalized and immigrant communities. Look at Iowa, where Pete Buttigieg, again, lost to Bernie Sanders, but he lost biggest of all when it came to Iowa's small but incredibly important non-white population of immigrant workers, of African Americans, of Latinos, of people from all over the world. Bernie Sanders won those people, and he won them handily. Ask yourselves why Pete Buttigieg, supposedly the young guy coming in to shake up old politics, has basically no support among young people. And that it's Bernie Sanders, the guy who's nearly 80 years old, who has all of that support, or at least a strong plurality of support amongst young voters, especially those people under 30 and even those people, 18 to 35. It's because Pete Buttigieg, the master of the status quo, doesn't actually represent young people, their ambitions, their concerns, and their struggles, because he doesn't understand it, because Pete Buttigieg grew up with a life of privilege and doesn't actually understand what it's like for most millennials to struggle in this day and age. Pete Buttigieg doesn't understand that. And ironic as it is, the candidate that best understands young people and the candidate who young people best understand is Bernie goddamn Sanders. And you also have to ask yourselves why Pete Buttigieg, who's been open about being one of the first major people to run for president and credibly have a chance from an LGBTQ background, why he isn't getting support among that population. And if you look at Iowa, the polling indicates that it was Bernie Sanders that did far better among that population than Pete Buttigieg did. And again, Pete Buttigieg is supposedly this outside figure, the guy who is different and will do different, but the people who have always been marginalized, who have always been made outsiders because of their race, or because of who they love, or because of their economic status, or because they're young people, none of those populations are going with Pete. They're all going with Bernie Sanders in much larger numbers and proportions. So that's the story right now. Pete Buttigieg may well supplant Joe Biden as the candidate of choice for the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party. But his whole image of being an outsider, underdog, young guy ready to shake things up is 100% a lie. And that if you want somebody who's going to truly bring progressive change and truly challenge the status quo, you only have Bernie Sanders as a realistic option.